The significance of complexity, with apologies to Ralph D. Stacey. Ralph Stacey published a diagram in 1996 that gained a lot of positive attention, created a lot of conversation in the workplace. But since publishing it, Mr. Stacey has regretted doing so. I'll explain why in just a little bit. Here is his diagram. You may have seen this before. Let's tear it apart a little bit and why I think it's still worth talking about. You can see on the left, he has along the y-axis requirements as a variable. Down at the bottom, we are close to agreement in the requirements. The top, we're far from agreement. Along the horizontal x-axis, similarly, we have technology close to certainty on the left, far from certainty on the right. Now, I like to view that y-axis as the what variable. And I like to view the x-axis as the how variable. And when I think in those terms, I can apply this diagram to a variety of situations. And you can see that in the bottom left, we have what Ralph Stacey would call a simple work environment, where what we're trying to accomplish is in solid agreement and how we're going to deliver it is fairly certain. Now, one of the reasons Mr. Stacey regrets this diagram is because if we even have the ability to confirm that we have a simple work environment, which is questionable to begin with, should that in itself guide us to which management process or product delivery process we should use? For example, if you're in a simple environment, it seems to make sense that traditional project management approaches, waterfall, would work nicely in that simple environment. And that has been the thinking around this for decades. Make sure we understand exactly what it is we're supposed to be delivering. Make sure we understand exactly how we're going to get it done. So you can put that all into a structured plan with supposedly a high degree of confidence in how that plan will play out on time, on budget, all expected features delivered. Once we start moving away from simple, we get into complicated, which means there are many parts to consider. And most of us will find ourselves moving up that center arrow towards complex, maybe even anarchy or chaos. A complex work environment is where there are not only many parts, but those parts are moving and interacting with each other in ways that may be difficult to anticipate, may be difficult to even control. Most of us in the professional world will find ourselves in this complex state. Some of us live in chaos. Some of us live in simple work environments. In simple work environments, over time, that work tends to be automated. In chaotic environments, sometimes that work is not sustainable. Complex. I've surveyed hundreds of people over the years. Most professionals say they work in the complex work environment, and there are days where it's chaotic, and there are days where it feels simple and in control. So far, this seems to make sense. So what's the real problem with this diagram? Well, to summarize Ralph Stacey's self-criticism, it's an oversimplification of the work environment. Let's, for example, add people to such a diagram. I'm going to assume that most of you listening are working in a people-based environment. You might be working in a robotic factory, but you're usually dealing with people in getting the work done. And people bring all kinds of variables and unknowns that are hard to anticipate, hard to control, maybe, such as cultural backgrounds, maybe time zone differences because you have people working all over the globe, language barriers, personalities, desires, goals, etc., etc. So now we add people to the mix. The graph becomes a little more challenging, but there's so much more, so much more. How about competitive threats? What about regulatory requirements, fixed deadlines that are completely out of your control, environmental considerations? The list just goes on and on. Can you determine the best business practice by looking at such a long list of variables? That's Mr. Stacey's argument against this chart. And yet, I still talk about it. And that's because I think it's a great conversation starter. Because we could look at such a chart and still acknowledge, hey, just because we believe we're in a certain place on this chart, we might not even be right about that. Does that really mean that we should use a chart to pick our management technique? But it's a great place to start the conversation. For example, if you're considering moving into an agile environment, and let's talk about Scrum specifically, where would Scrum fit in such a diagram? Well, if most professionals are living in this complex area here in the middle, with days where it's chaotic and days where it's simple, how can Scrum help us? Well, if you've got project work, if you've got a delivery, if you've got a work environment that's floating around there, spend some time to understand what the objectives are. Spend some time to understand some of the constraints like budget and time frame. And then working with your team, take a piece of that complex work environment, maybe a high priority piece or a high risk piece. Work with your team to understand that better. Spend a couple of weeks tearing it apart. Figure out how to build something. By doing that, you're dragging that piece of work down into the simple space where we have a much higher degree of agreement on what we're supposed to be building and how we're going to deliver it. Then, based on what you've learned, go back to that complex work, grab the next piece, dive into that, tear it apart, try to build something meaningful. By doing that, you're dragging that down to simple. And you do this repeatedly, iteratively, over time, increasing the overall knowledge about what's needed and how we're going to get it done. In summary, it looks like this. Right? Scrum helps us by taking small pieces of work that's floating more into the upper right space and bringing them down towards the lower left piece by piece. Now, again, with great respect for Ralph Stacey, this is a great discussion starter. I hope you found it helpful. Reach out to me if you have any questions. We'll keep the conversation moving along. Thanks for your time.